resistance is the often overlooked key to the emotional healing and somatic work that we're trying to do. If you're one of those people who's trying to feel your feelings and do the work, but you're struggling, it's very likely that this is a major reason why. Because we have many, many layers of unconscious resistance to many parts of ourselves, emotions and feelings and behaviors. And because it's unconscious, it's invisible. So it's like you're trying to feel a feeling, but there's this invisible barrier that you aren't aware of that's keeping you at a distance from it. And so it never fully kind of comes through, and it feels instead quite stuck, or like something isn't quite landing or being seen. And most of this work, I find, when you get down to it, is about resistance. If we're able to work with the resistance, to identify it and give it what it needs to relax, then the emotions just come up and through and integrate by themselves, really. So it's I can't stress how important this topic is. If you can learn to work skillfully with your resistance to your feelings, then that's sort of one of the biggest accelerators for your own healing path. And so in this video, I'm going to talk a little bit about what resistance is. I'm doing a bit of a Scooby-Doo impression there. Scooby-Doo was very resistant to his feelings, specifically fear. Actually, no, fear he allowed a lot. He would run away. Anyway, I'm not going to psychoanalyze Scooby-Doo here. I'm going to talk also about the consequences of resistance. And I'll give you a long list of the ways in which we do resist, which will be is interesting because there's a million more ways that we resist our emotions than you'd think. And then give you some tips on how to work with it. So let's dive in. So, you have to understand that you have a vast unconscious that's full of all kinds of stuff. Pretty much every single part of you, every single feeling that was never fully allowed lives down there. And it's all in the body. And your sort of body and personality structure is like a lid on all that stuff. Everything that ever happened that wasn't fully allowed. And this is also like a massive potential for transformation, because it's as we bring those things up to be seen to the light of consciousness, that is what transforms us at the deepest level. And so there's a huge potential for transformation down there too. And so what is resistance? Simply put, it's the rejection and denial of a part of us. And here I'm focusing mainly on feelings and emotions, which is a major part of what we deny. So the core defensive mechanisms humans have is to fragment or split themselves if a part of themselves is deemed to be a threat to your own safety. So say you're a kid and you get angry, but your parents really hate it when you get angry, so they send you to your room. That's a threat to your safety because you need that connection to your parents. So you'll split off that angry part and the anger that goes with it and push it down. And that becomes sort of unconscious. And then you'll have, in order to maintain that, you have to create layers of resistance, right? And there are many, many ways in which your body-mind does that, and we'll get to that later. But that's kind of like the dungeon keeper, right? You have this dungeon of stuff which isn't allowed because it's a threat to your safety, or it was at some very vulnerable point in your life. And resistance is like the dungeon keeper, keeping these parts of you deep down in the dungeons of your being, right? And so it plays a very important role. And it is important for us also because if we didn't have this, there would just be rage and sadness and helplessness and terror of annihilation just spewing everywhere all the time. So resistance, keeping all that stuff down, is what allows us to just get on with our day with, relative sanity. So it's not bad or wrong, but it's really helpful to slowly make it more conscious and start to work through some of this stuff. And when we kind of split in that process, that emotion that gets pushed down, it kind of gets frozen down in the body in a deep contraction. And that becomes like a frozen child. It's that part of you is still stuck at like the rage of your 5-year-old or the shame of your 7-year-old. And the reason this is difficult is because these frozen children become sort of like they're still active. They're still having an impact on your life. It's like you're seeing the world through an angry 5-year-old lens or a shamed 7-year-old lens. That's partly why we still feel like little children so often in different situations, because these parts are literally a filter through which we see the world. And we never really, that resistance that we learned, we never really unlearn. So it's like if you learn to resist your anger when you were 5, it's like that keeps looping, that stays in place. And there's no intellectual conclusion you can come to that's going to help that to relax. So this is why you've got to go into the body, actually. When it comes to working with resistance, we have to go and find that part of us, that dungeon keeper, which is a somatic, is a physiological energy in the body, and start to work through it. And that dungeon keeper, what's the architecture of resistance in this sense? That dungeon keeper tends to be made of like a tension, a defense of some kind, and an unconscious belief. So that you might be pushing down anger, and every time you get angry, you might feel really tense and anxious. That's that defense against holding the emotion down. And there'll be an unconscious belief like, if I get angry, I'm bad and no one will love me. That's kind of the programming that exists. There's always programming with the tension. So as soon as that anger comes up, it's like, fuck, no one's going to love me. Keep it down. And this all happens in the blink of an eye, unconsciously, without you becoming aware of it. Though you can become aware of these programming, and the programming here and the dungeon keepers and so on. So let's just give a few examples. One, I've given anger already, would be an example of something that wasn't allowed, so you had to split off from it and then defend it. Maybe hopelessness, for example, was another emotion. Maybe at some point you were a child and you felt hopeless, but your parents were kind of those go-getter parents, like, no, we can never give up. That's not allowed. We're not quitters. And so they'll force you to reject that energy, that emotion, that part of you, and instead maybe come up with a veneer of never quitting, a veneer of courage, sort of pathological courage, under any and all circumstances, as a defense, as a way of resisting that emotion. Or you can even resist positive emotions. If your parents were very depressed, for example, and you as a kid were expressing a lot of joy, that might have been very triggering for them. So they would shut you down in some way, and you learn in the same way that your joy is unacceptable and that emotion has to be pushed down. And you might get a programmed belief around it, like, if I express joy, then people won't like me. Then I'm a bad person. And so that program will keep looping in the background, and every time you won't be able to get too happy because it was a threat to your survival. So briefly, let's go over some of the consequences of resistance. Like, why does it matter? Well, because of this fragmentation, this splitting I told you about, we feel like we're not whole in some really fundamental way, that we're not together, that we're not complete. We feel very separate. And that's because we literally are. Like, within us, there are many parts that we are separated from, and that are fragmented, that are unconscious and are being pushed away from us. And as a result, there's a sense of lack, of maybe feeling trapped, feeling neurotic, pulled in different directions. We feel lonely because we are literally disconnected from parts of ourselves, and that manifests in the external world as being disconnected from other people. There can be, there's a core sense of inauthenticity because we're not fully being ourselves, because so many parts of us have been disowned. We can't fully be ourselves. We can only half be ourselves. And I mentioned already that the sense of separation, if we're separated from these parts in ourselves, we end up feeling much more separate from other people and things in the world. And then we need a whole bunch of coping mechanisms to deal with all of that, all of that pain of lack and inauthenticity and separation and neurosis. It's really, really painful. It's a really tough spot to be in. And so we turn to addictions of various kinds, be it substances or work or sex, or we, I'll go into this a bit more. We develop particular identities and ideologies that help keep us safe, or we numb out. I'll go into more detail in this in a bit later, but those coping mechanisms are very painful, and this is sort of the core reason. So let's get onto the list of the ways that we resist emotions, because we resist emotions much more frequently and in a much greater variety of ways than you would ever imagine. Most of what you're doing is in some way linked, or could be linked, to resisting an emotion. Now, I don't want to pathologize this. You want to be a little careful not to make it seem like this is bad or wrong. and then drive yourself crazy trying to not resist emotions all the time. But I'll give you a whole bunch of examples, and I think you'll see what I mean. So number one is thinking. A lot of the thinking we do. Have you ever noticed that your mind is thinking without stopping? Even though you clearly don't need to think without stopping. It's just continuously doing stuff. That's essentially to keep you out of its role, or one of its major roles is to keep you out of the body. As we start to go into the body, or when the thoughts stop or pause for a while, stuff starts to come up. Some of these repressed emotions start to come up. And that feels threatening because we're not really allowed to have a lot of these emotions, it feels. Because our society has essentially told us, our society, this is a point I wasn't planning on mentioning, but it's a really, really good one actually, that we're very, very heavily conditioned to resist our emotions, both by our parents. If most people had parents that were uncomfortable with emotion, and society as a whole is very uncomfortable with emotion. You can't just freely express and feel your emotions at school or at work or with most friendship groups. So we're very, very heavily conditioned that just emotion is bad and wrong. And so a lot of this thinking is just enacting that basic conditioning that emotions are bad and wrong, stay out of the body. And so it keeps you in your mind. You're in your mind all the time as a way of keeping you out of your body. Another one is anxiety. So I've noticed that anxiety in all my clients that I have that have come with anxiety, there's always some other emotion underneath it that is being held in place. And I would say in 90% of cases it's anger. Anxiety is a way of actually holding in anger, sometimes fear. That's why it's so tense. It's that muscular tension that's holding it in. Another one is depression. Depression, sometimes it's like a chemical imbalance in the brain. Most often not, though. In many cases, it's essentially a state of shutdown. Your nervous system has gone into shutdown because a sensation was too overwhelming. And that's normally a healthy thing that your nervous system can do. But it's meant to go into shutdown for a brief period of time and then come out of it. And it protects you from that overwhelming emotion. But depression is when you get stuck in a chronic state of shutdown. It becomes a trait, almost part of your personality. And it's sort of almost chronically trying to protect you from that overwhelming emotion. And this is why people who are depressed, they don't feel very much, right? Why? Because that's what it's designed to do. It makes sense. Another one is venting. So a lot of people, they rant or complain or vent. Again, this is a way of trying to get relief from a particular emotion. Often anger or a sense of helplessness. It's people who vent, they're often in a situation where they feel helpless. Someone has said something, there's nothing they can do. Some companies fuck them over and there's nothing they can do. They've got some problem with the government, there's nothing they can do. And this is really painful, but that sense of helplessness is so painful that they have to distract in some way, and so they vent and project that pain outwards. There's muscular tension. This is a really common way of just, as you'll kind of, what would go along with this is also a freeze response. The body might freeze, the muscles tense as a way of holding the emotions in when they're threatening to come up. Have you ever noticed that sometimes in social situations you might freeze or cease talking or talk less? That's your way. There was something coming up in you which which an unconscious part, there's some unconscious resistance to. So the nervous system shuts everything down to keep it in. Another common way, particularly in people, when there's a lot of trauma, is dissociating in some way. So we start to physically become disconnected from the body, and it becomes much harder to discern what we're feeling in our body. Parts feel numb. And again, this is just a protective mechanism that's very normal, but painful, where we just gradually become disconnected from the body because those sensations are simply too overwhelming to be with. Another one is busyness and distraction. So, you ever notice that you can't sit down for more than 60 seconds without looking at your phone or whatever? Partly that's kind of the addiction to the phone, but the main reason that many people are so busy and continuously distracting themselves is if you just sit in a room by yourself for 2 hours, painful stuff is going to start to come up. There'll be memories, shame might come up, or fear, or all kinds of things start to come up that we don't want to deal with. So we continuously keep busy. Another one is default emotions. So this is where one emotion feels safer than another. So say anger, we strongly resist anger and repress anger. If that anger starts to come up, we might start crying as a way to get relief. because crying feels acceptable. We learned that it was okay to cry. And so in this way, the crying, one emotion is actually a way of resisting another. And you can tell the difference between a sort of authentic emotion and this kind of covering emotion, in that if it's an authentic emotion, you can feel it and it will eventually move through. Whereas a covering emotion will keep looping because it's not kind of a genuine emotion, so you'll never get to the end of it. It just keeps looping and looping and looping because its function is to do that, to protect against that other emotion. Now here, as we get slightly more far out, your personality is in fact could be seen as a way of resisting certain emotions, because your personality is made up of those strategies which you discovered made you feel most safe. And so how you are in the world is kind of designed to avoid certain experiences and certain feelings at rock bottom, because what we're always avoiding at rock bottom is feeling a particular way, feeling alone, feeling abandoned, feeling unsafe. And so our personality is essentially designed from the ground up to avoid certain feelings. Getting more specific, identities. We construct identities and we hold on to them as a way of resisting certain feelings. So to give you an example, say I have an identity that I'm strong, like I'm a strong person who can deal with a lot. That's come into being for a reason. And it's not just the truth of who you are in some absolute sense, which doesn't, you can't pin people down in that kind of way. We all parts exist within us. There is a strong part within us. There is a weak part within us. There is a hard-working part within us. There's a not hard-working part within us. There's an aggressive part within us. There's a protective part within us, But we skew the balance of these. So if we believe I'm strong, it's because maybe the sense of being weak and helpless, that feeling, we felt very unsafe at a certain point. Maybe we grew up in a household where, our dad would shame us if we showed any sign of weakness, right? He'd get aggressive if we showed any sign of weakness, if you're a young boy, say. And in that case, you build up an identity of I'm strong as a way of protecting against those feelings of helplessness and fear that your father's gonna, not gonna love you. It's intense stuff. Another one is ideology, which functions in the same way. So often we'll attach to particular beliefs, political belief systems, spiritual belief systems, because it helps us to avoid certain feelings. So you could get really attached to like the law of attraction and like positive thinking in spirituality, kind of new agey stuff, because it promises that you can have everything you want without having to deal with any negative stuff. So it's like, oh great, I don't have to feel these feelings. So we get very attached to these beliefs because they help us to repress those painful feelings. Phew. So as you can see, there's an important one I've missed out. I see this a lot with clients, that as they start to approach certain feelings, weird things start happening in the body. The body can produce all kinds of experiences to deflect from emotions. One is confusion. Often as a way of deflecting from anger, confusion will arise. So there'll be a sense of like, why would they do that? Why would that person do that thing? I'm confused. When actually they know what they really want to say is fuck off. They want to tell that person to fuck off, but that feels so unsafe. They have to kind of feign this like, I don't know what's going on kind of thing as a way of getting some relief from that anger. And again, nothing wrong with this. It's very innocent. But this looks like the kind of thing people think confusion is natural. There's very few moments of genuine confusion we have in our life. When it comes to other people, most of the time we know exactly what's going on. It's just that we don't want to actually admit to ourselves that we are angry, for example, or that we're afraid. And so we respond with this confusion. Surprise kind of comes in that category. And also then there's a bunch of just distracting feelings. Chronic pain is one. When people start going near, when clients, often they start going near dangerous feelings. They'll start complaining of pain in the shoulder, or stuff will come in, or they get dizzy, or they start feeling nauseous. These are all sensations the body creates to sort of draw attention away from that feeling that feels unsafe, and these are all protective mechanisms. So that'll do for that session. I think, as you can see, it's very, very wide, and you might not think it's like, well, it can't every time I'm confused, or thinking, it can't be on resisting emotions. And to which I would ask, investigate. You would be very surprised. at what percentage of the time this kind of thing is actually masking something else. And I know from my own experience, for example, in my own life, I've worked through a lot of resistance to feelings. I've processed a lot of feelings, and my mind is probably has about 10% the frequency and density of thought that it used to. I think much, much less, because it's not required. And so I could see that entire thing wasn't necessary. The whole structure of thought wasn't necessary. It was just a way of maintaining these identities and structures that keep various feelings at bay. Sounds far out, but I'd encourage you to check it out, try it out for yourself. So now we finally get to it. How do you actually work with resistance? So you want to, the most important thing is that you want to go with the resistance. So you don't try and get rid of the resistance. You don't try and fix the resistance. You don't try and push it away. You welcome it in. Letting go is a welcoming forever and always. So it's all about coming to understand the resistance, acknowledging it, listening to what it has to say, feeling it, amplifying it, letting it fully be within you, becoming it. And that's when you integrate it and it relaxes, and what's beneath can come up to the surface. So that's the most important principle. And I'm going to give you some ideas of kind of how you can do that, roughly in order. So the first thing is to identify, resistance that's going on. And you can often it's a good thing to ask yourself, is like, as you're feeling feelings and things feel a little stuck, they're not quite moving. It's like, okay, how am I relating to this feeling? Say you feel some shame in your belly. You can ask yourself, like, do I want this to be here? Like, is it actually really fully okay that this is here? And you might get a little voice that's like, no, like I don't want this to be here. It's like, bam, there's the resistance. There's that part coming in. You can also do a reverse inquiry. This is from the Killer Bee Inquiries. It's a technique that you reverse what your body believes in order to bring up the resistance to it. An example makes this clear. So say there's shame in the belly. You could say something like, it's totally fine if this shame is here forever. I don't mind if this shame is here forever. And you might find a part comes in and goes like, no, it's not. I don't want that. Bam, again, you've made that resistance conscious. So this is the first step, identifying and making the resistance conscious. And you can get better and better and better at this the more you do it. It's a bit tricky at first. I have a lot of experience with myself and other people, so it makes it a bit easier. But the more experience you have, the more you can see it. Then is to acknowledge it and allow it. So you acknowledge this part of you, which it will come as a sensation and perhaps a voice. So it has sort of a somatic component and a cognitive component. And you want to kind of acknowledge both. They come together and allow them. So let that voice come in the head. It's like, I don't want this. I don't want this. Let that tension that's resisting the shame in the belly, for example, come in and let it be tense. And just let it know, okay, I see you. It's okay. You can be here. So you're letting the resistance be here. And now a little wrinkle. You can, of course, have resistance to resistance, in which case you would go up to the top layer of resistance and work with that first. This is quite common. So say you have anger, and then you have tension that's resisting the anger. You can then have shame come in at the fact that you can't allow your anger. And that's like resistance to the resistance. But don't worry about that too much at the beginning. Then you might want to dialogue with it to try and understand it a bit better. And here you can use all kinds of different questions. It's like, just find the part and ask it like it's a person. It's like, what do you fear is going to happen if I feel this shame? Like, what's the worst that's going to happen? Maybe it goes like, oh, you'll be a loser. Or it's like your parents will hate you. Something like that, right? And you can empathize. It's like, okay, that sounds scary. I hear you. Fuck. You could ask it, if you had a voice, what would you say? Often that's quite good if you've got that tension in the, some tension and it's not really giving away much. You can ask it if you had a voice, and it'll tell you, like, I'm scared or I'm angry, or you might get some memory come up. But you can dialogue in all kinds of different ways. Let me come up with a few more examples to give you a better sense of it. You could ask it, what do you need? What do you want? You could ask it, when was the first time that you felt this tension? And then you can go back to maybe some original early childhood memory, and maybe there's some work to do, some inner child work to do there. But the basic idea is to just do your best to compassionately understand this part of you, why it's doing what it's doing, what it's doing. You can ask it, why are you here? What's your purpose? And then listening to it. Then you want to feel it, and it can help. You want to really just lean into it. The phrase I use is always lean into it, like even just amplifying it a little bit. So if that tension is tight in the belly, you want to go with the grain. So rather than trying to push the resistance away, let it resist fully. It sounds counterintuitive, but you want to go with it. So you might let you might let your belly tighten. You let it tighten like 105, 110%. So if it's normally 100%, you just tighten it a little bit more. A good way of doing this is with rhythmic breathing. So you can breathe in and just let it tighten, and then as you exhale, just feel into the space around it. That gives it a good, nice like contraction, expansion kind of thing that can be quite good. Or if there's, with all the other kinds of resistance, maybe this is the nausea, you want to just feel the nausea and just let yourself really feel nauseous. If you've got that confusion that's coming in, again, let it sit right in the middle of that confusion. If you're feeling anxious and that's the resistance, it's like fully allow that anxiety. And it really helps. And it's just like, as you're really fully feeling it, that's what helps it to relax once it feels fully felt. Now, if it feels a bit stuck at some point, then there's a couple of things you can do. You might need to find out a bit more about it. There might be something you're missing. Or the final step, which would be to resource this sensation. Now, I have a whole video on resourcing. You can check it out. Just type in resourcing on my channel. But this is essentially bringing safety to that part. So you could do this in many, many ways. This could just be bringing a hand to that part of you. You could talk to it if it's kind of like a frozen child that you've identified by asking it, okay, when were you created, or when was the first time you felt this? Maybe you need to talk to that child, find out what it needs and bring it safety in some way. Give it a hug. Take it somewhere that feels safer. You can, with my clients, I always have them prepare, we prepare a resource before we dive in. So often it's like a friend or a teacher they've had who they feel really safe around, and might imagine that friend coming over to them and holding that part of them, reassuring it, letting know that they're there, they're not going to let go, that they're completely there for it. There's many, many ways, but you essentially want to bring safety and support and holding to that part of you that's resisting the feeling. And that can help it to soften. And so I've gone through that pretty quick, but there's more details that I give you in my how to get started with somatic work. I have a video called How to Get Started with Somatic Work, and I go into more detail there. So to summarize, resistance is really, really important. There's nothing wrong with it. It's very, very natural. But if we're struggling to heal, we want to slowly make it more conscious and learn to go with the flow of that resistance, identify the myriad ways that we are disconnecting from our feelings, and starting to get back in touch with that, so we can start to bring in those fragmented, isolated parts and start to feel more whole, more authentic, and less sort of lacking and incomplete and inauthentic. And we do this by identifying these parts, acknowledging them, welcoming them in, talking to them, understanding them, feeling them all the way through, and helping them to feel safe. Ta-da! And you just keep doing that over and over. And there's a caveat here. There is a danger that you can go too far, too fast, too hard. And so you want to stay within your window of tolerance of what you can handle. And you want to give space for integration afterwards as well. So you kind of nibble away at the biscuit of suffering, the biscuit of resistance. You don't try and swallow it whole. So you just go bit by bit, just practicing regularly, doing the work bit by bit. All right. I hope this was helpful. I do work with people one-on-one to support them to do this kind of work. So reach out if you would like support, or send me an email if you have any questions, and I'll do my best to answer them. Peace out.